The night had a weight to it, a hush that pressed against the skin like a wet shroud. And in the town of Marlowe's Hollow, Mississippi, in the autumn of 1880, the air smelled faintly of smoke and wet leaves, as though the very soil whispered warnings no one dared to hear. In the grand dining hall of the Cole estate, a dozen figures moved with ceremonial precision, their laughter brittle, their silverware clinking in rhythm with the unspoken tension. They did not know that this evening, meant for indulgence and celebration, would instead unravel the fragile threads of their lives, stretching them thin over a fire none could see. Among them was Jonathan Cole, the patriarch whose eyes held the weight of secrets he believed buried forever. Beside him, his guests, men of wealth and influence, plantation owners with reputations gilded by power and cruelty, each unaware that the night would strip them bare in ways no ledger or law could record. And in the kitchen a quiet figure worked, her hands steady, her movements precise. Esther Cole, the matron of the household, a woman whose smiles never quite reached her eyes, whose presence seemed to warp the light in the corners. Some whispered she had a gift, others called it a curse, but tonight, she alone knew the truth of the concoctions she prepared, the subtle herbs, the sweets folded with care, that carried an intent as invisible as it was lethal. As the candles flickered, casting long, crawling shadows against the paneled walls, the servants moved silently, the faintest rustle of silk and lace marking their passage. Outside, the wind howled, rattling shutters, bending the boughs of ancient oaks that clawed at the windows like skeletal fingers. And in that sound, the town's oldest residents swore they could hear whispers, names carried on the wind, though no lips had spoken them. On the dining table, the feast was laid with opulence that seemed almost obscene. Gilded platters heaped with roasted meats, sugar-dusted pastries that glimmered like snow in candlelight, and wines dark as ink pooled in crystal decanters. Each dish a masterpiece, each bite a temptation. Yet beneath the veneer of splendor, a quiet, almost imperceptible tension coiled like a serpent, ready to strike. It was in the way the silver fork trembled in the hand of one guest, the flicker of hesitation in another's eye. The night promised grandeur, but whispered, in the cracks of the polished wood and the hush of the servants' footsteps, that something unholy was at play. And when the first toast was made, voices raised in mirth and camaraderie, there was a tremor in the air, a subtle vibration that no one could explain, a prelude to horror, for this was no ordinary gathering, and this was no ordinary supper. Somewhere in the shadows of that hall, history waited to be rewritten in crimson ink, a story buried in whispered legends, in townsfolk's nightmares. And in the silent corridors of Marlowe's Hollow, Esther's eyes met no one's, and yet it felt as though every gaze in the room bent toward her, drawn by a gravity that had nothing to do with light. And in that instant the first bite was taken, and the night's true tale began. The laughter lingered for only a moment before it began to fray, stretching into silence, as if the room itself inhaled sharply. Guests raised their glasses, amber light dancing across the crystal. But there was a hesitation now, a shadow flickering behind eyes that once gleamed with entitlement. Thomas Whitaker, a man whose fortune had been carved from rivers and timber, took the first morsel of Esther's confection, a sugar-dusted tart, delicate in appearance, yet heavier than it seemed. There was a sweetness, almost intoxicating, but beneath it something metallic, something that pricked at the edges of perception. He chewed, swallowed, and for an instant smiled, but the smile did not reach the hollows beneath his eyes. And across the table, Reverend Harland, who had preached sermons in gilded pulpits, felt a chill crawling along his spine as he reached for the same tart. Fingers brushing the pastry's surface, a faint tremor passed through him, a warning his mind refused to acknowledge. Esther watched them all from the corner of the kitchen, invisible yet omnipresent, her face calm, composed, a mask that revealed nothing. Yet behind that mask a storm raged, for she understood the nature of the supper, the hidden calculus that would unfold over hours or minutes. As each bite began its silent work outside, the wind carried a moan through the oaks, the branches scratching at windows in rhythms too deliberate to be accidental. And the portraits on the walls, the ancestors who had long passed, their eyes painted with suspicion and expectation, seemed almost to move in the flickering candlelight, a subtle distortion, as if the house itself acknowledged the gathering horror. In whispered corners, the servants exchanged glances that spoke volumes, eyes wide, hands clutching trays, yet they moved with practiced obedience, bound by duty and fear. The room smelled of roasted meat and spices, of sugar and wine, but beneath it, an undertone of iron, of something old and predatory, lingered, a scent only some could sense. Jonathan Cole cleared his throat, attempting levity, but the words caught in his chest, a sudden tightness, an invisible hand pressing. As he reached for the wine, it trembled, spilling a thin stream across the white linen. But no one remarked on it, for attention was drawn elsewhere. To the youngest guest, Samuel Duval, who suddenly turned pale, his fork trembling, a bead of sweat sliding down his temple. He whispered almost to himself, "It tastes wrong," and the words were swallowed in the hum of the dining hall. The others ignored him, unwilling to challenge the night's unseen gravity. Yet something shifted, something delicate and invisible. A string pulled taut and the air seemed to vibrate, thickening with a presence that no one could name. In the corner, the silver chandelier swayed minutely, though there had been no draught, and a low creak passed through the floorboards as if the house exhaled. Warning, judgments, debts, sins long buried, all seemed to gather in that hall, bending the candlelight into shadows that reached like fingers. Each bite, each sip, each polite smile carried a weight heavier than iron, and the knowledge, unspoken but undeniable, settled over the table, that tonight, the supper was more than a meal. More than ceremony, it was a reckoning, and Esther, serene, precise, watched as her guests unwittingly began the journey from indulgence into dread, a journey whose end had been written long before the first tart had left her hands. The hall's laughter had long since died, replaced by a silence that seemed to thicken with each passing second. Guests shifted uneasily, glances darting like trapped animals, yet none dared speak of the unease that coiled in their chests. Thomas Whitaker's hand hovered over his wine, but it trembled not from the candlelight, nor from fatigue, but from a sensation that had no name. A whispering at the edge of consciousness. Jonathan Cole tried to regain control, cleared his throat, forcing a semblance of authority, but the words came out hollow, as if swallowed by the shadows themselves. And then the first anomaly revealed itself, subtle, almost imperceptible at first. The chandelier above them swayed, not violently, but with a rhythm that mirrored the pulse of the hall, and the candle flames bent toward it, elongating, quivering, as if drawn to something unseen. Across the table, Reverend Harlan's glass rattled softly, though the surface beneath it was solid, unyielding, and a shiver passed through him. A cold that clawed beneath his robes unsettled him more than he could articulate. Meanwhile, Esther moved silently among the kitchen shelves, tasting nothing yet aware of every detail, aware of how the pastries seemed to shift subtly in color and texture, as though alive in a manner forbidden. Even the most rational minds in the room felt it, the sense that the walls themselves were watching, listening, recording, the very air charged with a presence too intelligent, too patient to be mere coincidence. Outside, the oaks groaned, their branches scraping with deliberate insistence against the window panes, and the wind carried more than a howl. It carried murmurs, words formed in the spaces between sound, too fast to catch, yet lingering long enough to press against the mind. Samuel Duval's face had turned ashen, beads of sweat dotting his temples, and he whispered again, "It moves, something moves," but no one turned to him, dismissing the words as hysteria, and yet the floorboards creaked in uneven patterns, as though the house itself paced around them, invisible, patient, its intentions inscrutable. A chill crept along the spine of each guest, subtle, insidious, and Jonathan Cole realized with a mounting sense of panic that the air had grown heavier, thicker, as if inhaling it required effort. As the main course was served, a strange, cloying scent mingled with the spices and roast, an undertone neither pleasant nor overtly foul, something old, metallic, almost sacred in its severity. Thomas Whitaker touched his fork again, and noticed it felt unnaturally cold, as though the silver had drawn heat from his body. And when he glanced across the table, he thought he saw shadows bending toward the center of the hall, pooling, elongating, forming shapes that mirrored the guests' worst fears. But when he blinked, they were gone, leaving him questioning his own mind. Esther, meanwhile, remained a ghost of composure, a calm observer, whose eyes hinted at truths the others could not bear. She knew the patterns, the hidden forces she had summoned, forces older than the town, older than the house, older than the last whispers of the enslaved souls whose labor had built the walls. And yet the guests could not see, could not understand, only feel the subtle pressure tightening around their hearts. Around the table, forks clinked nervously, glasses rattled, and the shadows stirred as if impatient, aware that the supper had begun, and that none at that table would leave the same as they had arrived. No one spoke of the family history. Though every guest knew whispers of the Coles' past haunted the town, stories half told, suppressed, hidden in old diaries and burned letters. Yet tonight, those whispers pressed against the walls, thickening the air with unseen menace. Jonathan Cole's lineage was steeped in secrecy, the kind meant to protect and terrify. The Coles were not merely wealthy. They were guardians of a darkness few dared name, handed down through generations in silver spoons and sugar bowls. Esther, the matron, carried it in her veins, a quiet inheritance, a power older than law or morality. Her hands were steady, precise, but every movement was calculated, a silent invocation of forces that had slept for decades. And now stirred, awakened by the feast, Samuel Duval, youngest of the guests, now trembled openly, his hand clutching his stomach as a wave of nausea overcame him. He looked to the others for confirmation, but their faces betrayed nothing, only strained attempts at composure. Yet the effect was undeniable. One by one, the guests began to feel it, a prickling heat along the veins, a heaviness in the chest, as though some unseen hand was marking them. The eldest, Thomas Whitaker, tried to rise, perhaps to call for air for help, but his limbs felt locked, unnatural stiffness creeping into his joints, and a cold sweat coated his brow. Reverend Harland muttered a prayer under his breath, but the syllables faltered, twisting into nonsense, and a low hum seemed to vibrate from the walls themselves. It was a sound felt more than heard, pressing against eardrums and skulls in equal measure, the portraits lining the hall. Painted ancestors with eyes that had once followed their descendants with suspicion now seemed almost alive. The painted lips curled slightly, unnervingly in recognition or warning, and in the kitchen, Esther moved as if guided by instinct, tasting nothing, yet feeling every subtle tremor of the room. She alone understood the mechanics, the inevitable unfolding, and the whispers of her ancestors' voices echoed in her mind, commanding precision, patience, restraint. The guests were no longer simply eating. They were participating in a ritual older than any of them could comprehend. Their bodies, their minds, entwined in a design invisible yet absolute. A shadow passed across the faces of the diners, a living thing, stretching, elongating, coiling like smoke around their forms. And even the bravest felt a pull in their stomachs, a vertigo that was neither sickness nor fear alone. It had a name known only to the Coles, a secret never spoken aloud, a curse embedded in sugar and flour, in the very way the pastries had been folded. The first coughs began quiet at first, then sharper, rasping through lungs that seemed to resist the air. The candles flickered violently, as though responding to a force unseen, throwing walls into sharp angles that fractured the familiar geometry of the hall. And then, just as Jonathan Cole attempted to steady himself, a reflection in the polished silverware caught his eye, a shadowed face that did not belong to him, a whisper of malice etched into the corners of the image. He blinked and it was gone. Yet the feeling remained, a scar upon his perception. Samuel gasped, doubled over, clutching his gut, muttering incoherently, and the room seemed to lean toward him, almost aware, almost hungry. Every guest now felt it, the creeping certainty that they were no longer in control, that something older than justice, older than God, had set its gaze upon them. And Esther, serene, precise, watched as the first subtle punishments were inflicted. Knowing the deeper horrors would follow by now, the room no longer felt like a dining hall but a crucible, a place where time and reason bent under the weight of unseen intent. The guests' laughter had evaporated entirely, leaving only strained, shivering silence, and the ticking of the grand clock on the mantel sounded unnatural. Dragging seconds into grotesque lengths, Samuel Duval's eyes darted from plate to plate, as though he feared the food itself might strike. Each pastry glimmered with an unnatural sheen, sugars twisted into patterns that were not quite geometric, not quite random. A soft vibration hummed beneath the table, imperceptible to most. Yet in each guest it stirred nausea, dread, a gnawing awareness that the meal was alive in a way that defied logic. Jonathan Cole reached for a slice of honeyed meat, and the knife trembled in his hand. quivering as if guided by something else. He hesitated, sensing a pulse beneath the surface of the dish, and recoiled, a cold dread pooling in his stomach. Thomas Whitaker's glass of wine sloshed, though he had not moved, ripples forming concentric circles, as if some invisible force toyed with its surface. Reverend Harland muttered hurriedly, words losing meaning as they left his lips. Language corrupted by fear, by presence, by something older. The shadows on the walls had begun to twist independently, detaching from the figures that cast them, crawling along the floor, reaching upward, clawing at the candlelight, stretching toward the guests with silent intent. Esther's gaze never wavered, her hands deft, calm, yet every flicker of movement, every rise of shadow had been anticipated, orchestrated with the precision of one accustomed to commanding forces that bent nature itself. The first taste of the dessert was taken by Samuel, and a sudden convulsion racked his body, his fingers twitching, as though the sugars themselves had struck at his nervous system. A faint, high-pitched tone threaded through the air, impossible to locate yet inescapable, pressing against eardrums, filling the skull. And in that tone, each guest sensed their sins, their debts, their betrayals rendered visible in terror. Each bite became a contract, a binding, a covenant of suffering they had not chosen. Their veins burned, muscles tightened, a tightness in the chest like iron bands, and the room felt smaller, walls breathing in rhythm with some dark heart, hidden in the floorboards. Thomas Whitaker's eyes widened as he watched a shadow peel itself from his own body, writhing in the candlelight like a serpent of ink, stretching toward the ceiling. He tried to cry out, but his throat locked, and a dry rasp filled the silence. The food on his plate trembled now, rising slightly as if buoyed by invisible hands. A sprig of rosemary quivered, its tips bending toward him with unnatural eagerness. The guests began to notice one another, panic rising in mirrored reflections. Yet words failed to carry meaning, sentences twisting mid-air, comprehension breaking apart. In the kitchen, Esther poured syrup over a cake, and the golden liquid twisted unnaturally, running upward against gravity before settling, as if obeying a force older than reason. Each dish, each bite was a mechanism of influence, a silent lever pressing at mind and body, and the guests were trapped in the tightening machinery of her supper. One by one, subtle tremors of the body hinted at the coming carnage, a foreshadowing none could yet name. Shadows writhed, air thickened. The room seemed alive, hungry, and all the while, Esther's eyes flickered with satisfaction. Knowing the true feast had only just begun, a sudden silence fell over the dining hall, heavier than before, thick enough to press against the skin. The guests froze mid-gesture, forks suspended, eyes wide with a dawning recognition that the night's unease had sharpened into something dangerous. Samuel Duval was the first to convulse, a sharp spasm seizing his body as he lurched from his chair, eyes rolling back, and a strangled gasp tore from his throat. The room erupted in panic, but words fell flat, swallowed by an oppressive pressure that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. Thomas Whitaker reached for him, but as his fingers brushed Samuel's arm, a shock of icy pain shot up his own spine, forcing him back, a hiss escaping his teeth in disbelief. Esther remained still, her expression unreadable, yet her hands moved subtly, adjusting plates, arranging knives and glasses with a meticulousness that belied the chaos, as though the room's horror were a performance she alone orchestrated. The chandelier above swayed violently now, though no draught entered the hall, casting fractured light that stretched the shadows across the walls into grotesque shapes, and in each flicker, the guests glimpsed faces that were not their own, twisted masks of accusation and dread. Jonathan Cole pressed a hand to his chest, a sudden tightness constricting his lungs, a metallic taste flooding his mouth, and he realized with chilling clarity that this was not illness, not fatigue, but something deliberate, something alive and patient. Moving through the very air they breathed, he tried to summon courage, attempted a prayer, a word of reason, but it died in his throat, curling into silence as the room's pulse accelerated, a rhythm independent of heartbeats, independent of time. Reverend Harland muttered under his breath, trembling, recognizing a truth he had long denied, that some forces, old and patient, cared little for doctrine, for morality, for men, and would strike where they pleased. Across the table, the pastries quivered as if breathing, the sugars twisting into patterns that writhed like living serpents. Samuel's body convulsed again, foam forming at his lips, and the metallic undertone in the air sharpened into a sting. His eyes darted to the others, pleading silently, and for the first time, they saw it, the subtle trembling in every guest, a shared pulse of fear, as though the supper itself had become a predator. Each dish a trap, each bite a contract written in invisible ink. Thomas Whitaker's hand trembled over his wineglass, and the liquid rippled, rising slightly as if drawn toward an unseen center. Shadows peeled from walls, twisting toward the table, a mass of black undulating intent. And the portraits on the panels seemed to lean, their painted eyes narrowing, observing the unfolding carnage with expectation. Jonathan's chest heaved, muscles locking, sweat beading on his brow, and he realized his voice would not carry. Any call for help rendered meaningless by the oppressive gravity that filled the hall. A candle flickered violently, nearly extinguishing, and in that brief darkness, Samuel's eyes rolled fully back, body limp, and the first death claimed the room, silent and final, leaving only the echo of strained breathing and muted horror. No one moved, for movement seemed forbidden, the act of intervention inconsequential, before forces invisible and patient. Waiting, testing, calculating the pattern of fear, Esther remained at the periphery, unshaken, her calm a quiet dominance over the chaos, her lips pressed into a line that suggested satisfaction, not cruelty, though the two were inseparable in the room's current logic. Thomas Whitaker felt the shadows brush his ankles, subtle at first, then curling upward like smoke, and the chill spread, seeping into bones and blood alike. Reverend Harland fell to his knees, whispering fragmented prayers to a God who had long since ceased to answer, as though the night itself mocked devotion. Every breath felt thick, every heartbeat amplified, a percussion of impending doom. And the dining table, the once opulent banquet, now seemed a sacrificial altar, each dish a ceremonial instrument, each utensil a silent witness. Samuel's body now motionless, a grim testament, the first domino to fall in a sequence unseen but inevitable. The other guests could no longer distinguish between shadows and flesh, between the food and the air, between fear and reality. Metallic tangs filled mouths. Sugar curdled on tongues into bitterness, and each movement drew the attention of the unseen presence. The room's pulse had become a predator's rhythm, patient, omnipresent, and the realization struck with icy clarity: this supper was alive. And they were prey. Jonathan Cole's hands shook violently as he tried to rise, only to feel a tether, invisible, pulling him downward. Restraining him in silent obedience, Esther's calm radiated across the room, commanding without word or gesture, and the guests understood. In the deepest parts of themselves, that resistance was impossible. One by one, the room became a tableau of fear and paralysis, the first victim lying motionless, the shadows thickening, each heartbeat a drum in the orchestra of horror. Esther observed quietly, tasting nothing. Yet every twitch of a muscle, every faltering breath, every bead of sweat informed her of the feast's progress. She had orchestrated this for years, preparing for the moment when the unsuspecting would unknowingly consume their fate. And now it had begun in earnest. A ritual older than memory, older than law, older than mercy itself. And outside the wind howled, rattling shutters and scratching at windows, a chorus of warning ignored. Yet it mattered little, for inside the supper had awakened, and those seated would soon learn the true weight of indulgence. The cost of curiosity and the depth of secrets some tables were never meant to host. The first death was but a beginning, and the house alive and patient watched, waiting for the next to falter. The dining hall had transformed entirely, no longer a place of comfort or ceremony, but a chamber of suffocating dread. The walls seemed to lean inward, pulsating subtly, breathing, carrying whispers that threaded through the air like invisible tendrils. No one could locate the source, and yet every guest felt it. Murmurs tugging at memory, dredging up sins, debts, betrayals that had been buried for decades. Thomas Whitaker pressed a hand to his temple, a pulse of pain ricocheting through his skull as the whispers named each misdeed, the room itself a confessor without mercy. Samuel Duval lay pale and motionless, a cautionary figure, and the others understood the pattern, a deadly rhythm establishing itself. Jonathan Cole shivered as the chandelier above creaked, its crystals refracting candlelight into spectral eyes that seemed to blink in recognition. Shadows twisted across the walls independently of the figures that cast them. elongating, curling, slithering toward the table with intent. Patient, inexorable, Esther observed quietly, her presence a quiet gravity, a calm in the storm she alone had summoned. Her hands adjusted silverware with subtle gestures, almost imperceptible, yet every motion resonated through the hall, as if commanding the shadows themselves. She did not taste the food, yet she could feel its influence. The way it moved through the air, through the veins of the guests, each spice, each sugar crystal a conduit for the unseen. Thomas's knees buckled as the floorboards beneath him seemed to breathe, contracting and expanding in a rhythm matched only by the pulse of fear in his chest. The portraits lining the walls seemed to lean forward, eyes narrowing, lips twitching with silent amusement or warning, their painted features stretching unnaturally in candlelight, as if the ancestors themselves acknowledged the supper's true purpose. A chill swept across the room, rising from the floor, carrying with it the iron tang of inevitability. Jonathan realized with horror that the whispers were not merely sound, they were intention, intelligence, a focus that reached into the mind and coiled, testing, taunting, pulling the threads of memory and fear until the psyche trembled. Samuel's shallow breath seemed to sync with the low hum vibrating from the walls, and the air itself became viscous, resisting movement. Each step toward escape meeting invisible resistance. Reverend Harlan's prayers faltered, words twisting into nonsense mid-air, as if the language itself had been confiscated, leaving him raw, exposed, powerless. The table had begun to shift subtly. Angles changing, surfaces warping imperceptibly, plates tilting, food sliding. A silent rearrangement guided by a will none could perceive. Thomas tried to steady his hand over a glass of wine, only to watch the liquid climb. Thin rivulets defying gravity, coiling like dark snakes, and a tremor passed through his body. The whispers grew louder, voices threading together, layering over one another, carrying fragments of confessions, secrets whispered to no one, sins unspoken yet known now. The air pressed heavier still, a weight tangible, suffocating. The very room alive with observation, with judgment. Jonathan's eyes darted around, catching glimpses of movement in peripheral vision, shapes that slithered along walls, corners where shadows pooled unnaturally, stretching upward, twisting around fixtures and chairs, each one moving as if aware of the guests' terror. A faint metallic taste filled mouths. The remnants of desserts and wine transmuted into bitter reminders that indulgence was a trap, a contract sealed invisibly. Each guest felt their pulse escalate, their breath quicken, the room's rhythm merging with their own heartbeat, until the boundaries between self and the chamber dissolved, leaving only fear, exposure, and anticipation of what would come next. Esther's calm remained absolute, her eyes flickering with unspoken satisfaction. She did not need to act overtly, for her influence was woven into every detail. The curvature of a plate, the shimmer of sugar, the subtle sway of candlelight. The shadows responded, the whispers obeyed. The room bent to her will, each element a cog in the mechanism of horror she had designed. Jonathan's hand brushed the edge of the table, and a shock of icy electricity coursed through him, leaving him gasping, eyes wide with terror. The others mirrored his dread, their muscles taut, minds stretched thin, as if the house itself was drawing life from their fear. Each sensation amplified, every thought intercepted. Outside, the wind rattled shutters, carrying a low, mournful keening, yet inside, the world of the Coles swallowed all sound, all reason. All that remained was the hall, the table, the shadows and the whispers threading into consciousness, weaving an invisible web that each guest now realized they could not escape. And as Esther's gaze swept the room, she seemed to acknowledge each faltering heartbeat, each shiver, each tremor of terror, knowing the true supper had only begun. The night still young, the shadows hungering, and the whispers promising that what was coming would not be borne lightly by the living. The shadows had grown bold now, peeling from walls and floors, no longer passive observers but predators, coiling around chairs, twisting around ankles, brushing against the skin like living tendrils. Thomas Whitaker recoiled, a cold shock racing up his spine, his limbs locking as if the shadows themselves weighed upon him. Each breath became a labor. The air thickened with an unseen pressure, and the metallic tang that had lingered in the desserts now burned at the back of every throat. Jonathan Cole's gaze darted frantically, catching a shadow lifting from the wall, a sinuous form that mirrored his own, yet moved with autonomy, stretching and writhing toward the center of the room with deliberate intent. The chandelier above swayed violently, splintering reflections across the faces of the guests, eyes widening in terror as the shadows lengthened, merging, curling, forming shapes too grotesque to name. Each guest now felt the first real brush of mortal danger, a premonition clawing at ribs and sinew, as if the shadows could pierce flesh. And some had begun to do so. Samuel Duval's body twitched violently, limbs jerking without control, and when he attempted to speak, only a gurgle escaped, Esther's calm eyes tracking every movement, noting each subtle convulsion, each stutter of fear, her hands unmoving yet orchestrating every whisper of motion in the room. The shadows pressed closer, pooling around plates, crawling up table legs, brushing wine-stained hands, curling around silverware, and when one tendril brushed Thomas's wrist, the metal of his watch bent unnaturally. Curling like melted iron, Jonathan's chest tightened, ribs constricting as if the air itself were liquid iron, and he staggered back, the shadow following. Patient, relentless, aware of every tremor of fear. The portraits on the walls seemed to breathe, eyes widening, painted mouths twitching, a silent mockery or perhaps a warning, but the guests could not look away, transfixed, helpless before the unfolding. Unholy choreography. A faint, whispering hum grew louder, threading through the hall, vibrating in bones and teeth, resonating in skulls, carrying with it fragments of memory, regret, shame, sins long suppressed now thrust into vivid awareness. Thomas clawed at the table, wine spilling across white linen dark as blood, pooling beneath the shadows that writhed hungrily. Samuel's pale face twisted in agony, the shadows pressing into him, curling around limbs and throat, and then a faint, wet, tearing sound broke the oppressive silence. Jonathan recoiled in horror, unable to look yet unable to turn away. Recognizing the inevitable that had begun, Esther moved silently to the side, the spectre herself in the chaos, her hands resting lightly on a platter. Yet every dish, every utensil, every sugar crystal seemed to respond to her presence. The shadows, the whispers, the very room bent and swirled in harmony with her intent. Each convulsion of the guests, a note in a symphony of horror. Jonathan's knuckles whitened as he gripped the edge of the table, the shadows brushing against him again, pressing cold, unyielding. And when his eyes flicked downward, he glimpsed tendrils wrapping around Samuel's wrist, the flesh paling beneath them as if life itself were being drawn into darkness. The candles flickered violently, guttering wax dripping like molten veins, shadows leaping from one surface to another, and the low hum now carried words, coherent yet horrifying, naming each guest, detailing their misdeeds, their secrets, their vulnerabilities. Jonathan tried to speak, but his voice fractured mid-word, swallowed by the pressure of the room, and he understood with icy clarity that reasoning would avail him nothing. The supper had become a predator, and they were prey. The metallic tang sharpened, filling nostrils, clawing at taste buds, and with each passing second, the shadows became bolder, curling higher, striking faster. A test of endurance and fear, Thomas gasped, muscles locking as the shadow coiled around his chair, squeezing, and he realized that this was no longer an assault of mind alone, but of body, each movement monitored, restricted, punished. Jonathan tried to pull Samuel back, only to find an invisible resistance, a tethering force that held both men in place, the shadows pressing ever closer, cold, sentient, aware of the panic that flooded veins and twisted muscles. Each guest felt it now, the first unmistakable sensation of death brushing fingertips, cold and deliberate, and in the center of the room, Esther's calm remained unbroken, her eyes glimmering faintly with triumph and precision, each shadow, each whisper, each convulsion flowing from her presence as though she alone commanded the night. The hall had become a trap, a crucible, the supper a ritual of revelation and punishment, and the first clear understanding struck every surviving guest. No one would leave untouched, no one would leave alive, and the shadows, patient and relentless, were merely beginning their work. The shadows no longer merely brushed or coiled, they struck. Swift, deliberate, and impossibly silent, Thomas Whitaker cried out, a sound half choked, half rending, as the darkness enveloped him, curling around his torso, constricting, tugging, a force neither seen nor heard but felt in every fiber of his body. The metallic tang of sugar and wine now burned on every tongue, a corrosive reminder that indulgence had consequences. Jonathan Cole lunged toward him, muscles taut, yet invisible tendrils wound around his limbs, restraining him as if the very air had thickened into iron chains. Esther observed quietly from the edge of the hall, her hands motionless, yet every action, every strike of the shadows, flowed from her will, a precision honed over decades, shadows and whispers bending to her command. Samuel Duval whimpered, convulsing against invisible pressures, his face pale, eyes rolling, and Jonathan realized the whispers were now commands, subtly guiding the darkness to punish with intent. Not accident. The chandelier above swung violently, crystal prisms shattering tiny arcs of light that flickered over the walls, elongating the shadows into grotesque forms, writhing like serpents in midair. The room's pulse, once subtle, now throbbed audibly in every chest, a low, resonant vibration that rattled teeth and bones, as if the house itself had awakened, aware, hungry, and patient. Every guest felt it, the deliberate intelligence of the force pressing upon them, the inevitability of fate entwined with fear. Jonathan's eyes flicked to Samuel and Thomas, shadows curling around limbs, constricting, the first mortal consequences visible, bodies reacting, trembling, convulsing under pressure. They could neither name nor resist. Reverend Harland fell to his knees, sobbing, hands pressed to his ears as the whispers layered into a maddening chorus, naming sins, threatening sins, demanding acknowledgement. No salvation offered, only the unrelenting work of revelation and punishment. A faint cracking sound echoed, subtle yet terrifying, as if bones themselves were bending under pressure. Thomas's convulsions grew sharper, limbs thrashing, yet the shadows held patient. Almost clinical in execution, Samuel's face contorted, a gurgle of pain breaking through as his body stiffened. And then the room seemed to inhale, stretching seconds into grotesque eternity. Jonathan felt the invisible pressure tighten in his chest, ribs constricting, and the room's pulse mirrored that of the victims. Synchronization of fear and physical torment. The paintings seemed to lean further, their eyes glinting in candlelight, mouths curling, lips twitching in silent mockery or satisfaction. Ancestors witnessing, approving, orchestrating, or perhaps warning in ways the living could not comprehend. The whispers threaded through minds, each guest hearing their own thoughts reflected. Distorted, weaponized, revealing hidden guilt. The first deaths a prelude to the revelations still to come. The first fatality was subtle in sound, but absolute in effect. Thomas's convulsions ceased abruptly, his body slumping, lifeless, the shadows receding only to curl. Patient around the next target, Jonathan staggered back, unable to comprehend the sudden silence that followed. The metallic tang in his mouth now acrid, biting, a taste of death. Samuel lay twitching, barely conscious, the shadows still clutching, pressing, and Jonathan understood in icy clarity that resistance was impossible, that the supper was alive, and they were its instruments of fear, its prey. Esther's calm radiated across the room, a quiet perfection, unshaken by chaos, her eyes tracing each movement, each death, each faltering heartbeat, cataloging, orchestrating, commanding without a gesture. Jonathan tried to speak, to warn, to intervene. Yet his voice fractured, swallowed by invisible pressure, his words disintegrating in the thick, charged air. Shadows stretched higher, brushing chandeliers, climbing walls, wrapping plates, moving with intent, alive with a force older than memory, older than law, older than mercy. Each passing moment stripping agency, tightening the web around the remaining guests. Each heartbeat became a countdown, each breath a labor, and Samuel whimpered, his body convulsing again, tendrils coiling around his chest, constricting, suffocating. As Jonathan realized the inevitability, there would be no mercy, no escape, no intervention sufficient to halt the pattern set centuries before. The supper claiming its toll one by one. Esther's hands rested lightly, almost absent, yet every convulsion, every twitch, every gasp fell under her orchestration. Shadows and whispers, food and air, fear and memory, all instruments in a symphony of revelation and judgment. Jonathan understood with stark clarity that the Coles' supper was not a mere gathering, not a simple banquet, but a ritual, a conduit of punishment, its logic invisible but absolute. And the first life taken was only a whisper of the horrors still to unfold. The hall trembled subtly, a heartbeat in rhythm with unseen machinery. And outside, the wind moaned as if warning the town. Yet inside, the supper continued, patient, precise, and deadly. its appetite far from sated. The room had become a living nightmare, walls breathing, shadows twisting like serpents, each movement deliberate, each tendril of darkness aware. Jonathan Cole staggered to his feet, chest constricting, lungs burning. Yet the floor beneath him resisted, subtle but unyielding, an invisible hand pressing. Tethering, ensuring compliance, Samuel Duval convulsed again, his body racked by forces he could not see, hands clawing at the table, as if it were the only anchor left to a world that had dissolved into chaos. The metallic tang of sugar and wine coated his tongue, acrid and bitter, a taste of mortality, and the whispers threaded into his mind, naming sins, listing weaknesses, twisting memory into terror. Esther watched, serene, her presence the calm eye of the storm, orchestrating each pulse, each contraction, each death with a precision that suggested centuries of practice. Every detail of the room responding to her silent command. Thomas Whitaker's body, already gone, hung like a silent warning, yet the shadows seemed unsatisfied, curling toward the remaining guests with renewed intent, climbing chair legs, brushing ankles, wrapping fingers, teasing skin with invisible claws. Jonathan realized with a shiver that the table itself had become a predator, its surfaces warping subtly, edges stretching, plates tilting in response to the unseen force. Every guest felt their heart race, not with exertion but with dread, a rhythm forced upon them by something older than reason. Reverend Harland collapsed to his knees, whispers threading into his mind now in full sentences, naming betrayals, misdeeds, confessions unspoken, and he sobbed silently, powerless to resist. The chandelier above creaked violently, almost dislodging, crystal prisms scattering fractured light across the room, shadows twisting higher, merging, coiling like living smoke. A mass aware of intent and anticipation, hungry for fear and compliance. The pastries quivered subtly, sugars twisting into impossible patterns, the dessert now an instrument of influence, not nourishment. Samuel's hands shook violently, tremors passing through every limb, as if the sugar and herbs were conduits, channels for the unseen force. Jonathan's chest tightened again, ribs pressing inward as though the very air had thickened, and he gasped, aware that resistance was futile. That which had begun as subtle manipulation now asserted itself physically. Tendrils brushing skin, lifting hair, curling around arms and legs with the precision of a surgeon. Invisible yet undeniable, the portraits lining the walls seemed to lean closer, painted eyes glinting, mouths curling with silent amusement or approval. Ancestors observing the ritual unfold, approving the methodical culling, a testament to centuries of secrecy and power. Thomas's body still lay as a warning, yet the room demanded more, feeding on fear, testing resolve, extracting reactions, and the living trembled under the weight of anticipation. Jonathan caught sight of Samuel's eyes rolling, convulsions intensifying, body stiffening under invisible pressure, and he realized the supper's intent was now indisputable. Death would be the currency, terror the medium. The whispers now threaded through minds with increasing complexity, layering guilt over fear, a web of psychological torment as deliberate as the physical assault. Each breath felt drawn out, heavy, saturated with presence, and the room responded to panic, intensifying with each falter. Jonathan's legs buckled, yet the shadows pressed, coiling higher reaching, the table itself a predator, knives and plates aligning subtly to channel dread, as if every object was complicit, every surface a tool. Every heartbeat became synchronized with the room's pulse, a rhythm of terror, inevitability, and absolute domination. Jonathan's mind struggled to separate reality from hallucination, to locate agency in a space that had none. Samuel's convulsions ended only briefly. As the shadows shifted to the next target, Esther's calm remained absolute, her presence the axis around which chaos revolved, subtle movements of her hands, slight tilts of the head, seemingly idle gestures, yet each triggered motion in shadows, whispers, even the food, as if she were conducting an orchestra of fear. Jonathan's attempts to move, speak, intervene were resisted by forces invisible yet precise. The metallic taste in the mouth sharpened, acrid and bitter, and the remaining guests understood with stark clarity that the supper was not a meal but a ritual, a carefully constructed mechanism of revelation and punishment. Thomas's death a prelude, Samuel's torment a warning, and Jonathan's fear a necessary ingredient in the feast's grim calculus. Shadows and whispers now fully assertive, The room alive, aware, patient. A chill swept across the hall, rising from the floor like liquid ice, pressing into veins and sinew. Tendrils of darkness reaching into the living, wrapping, testing, constricting. Samuel's body shuddered violently as the shadows pressed tighter, and Jonathan felt a creeping certainty that no one would survive unscathed. The chandelier swayed, light fractured, the walls breathed, and the whispers now formed sentences. Direct, naming sins, weaknesses, lies, unspoken truths. Each guest now understood that resistance was futile. The supper alive, the shadows predators, the whispers instruments, and the night had only begun. Esther's calm and unyielding force, orchestrating the carnage with precision beyond comprehension. Jonathan's gaze swept the room, catching every twitch, every shiver, every gasp of the remaining guests. Shadows stretched from wall to ceiling, curling around objects. Surfaces, wrapping limbs, coiling around torsos. Aware, deliberate, patient, every movement a test. To every twitch a measure of compliance, Samuel whimpered. A soft sound swallowed instantly by the room's pulse. The metallic tang of death coating every tongue. Every remaining soul realized the pattern. The feast was alive, the supper a ritual, the shadows instruments of punishment, and Esther its conductor, patient, precise, inexorable, and the table had only begun its work. The hall had become unrecognizable, shadows no longer mere darkness, but entities with shape. Intent and hunger, Jonathan Cole felt them brush against his arms, tendrils curling with subtle pressure, testing boundaries, his muscles tensing against invisible resistance. Every breath was laborious. The metallic tang of sugar and wine now sharp and invasive, coating tongues, filling nostrils, and he understood with a shiver that the meal had become a conduit. Each ingredient, each utensil, each surface a channel for forces older than memory. Thomas Whitaker's body still lay as warning, but Samuel Duval's convulsions intensified, the shadows wrapping tighter, curling, constricting. Lifting him partially from the chair, a whisper threading through Jonathan's mind, naming fears, sins, secrets long buried, and he realized the unseen hands were not random, but deliberate, intelligent, and infinitely patient, orchestrating suffering with precision. Esther remained poised, her gaze calm, her hands almost inert, yet influencing every movement in the hall. The shadows responded instantly to her presence, coiling higher, twisting around chairs, curling along table legs, brushing against ankles. Each contact a subtle assertion of dominance. Jonathan tried to call out, to intervene, but the pressure in the air thickened, constricting his chest, and his words fragmented mid-thought. Swallowed by the rhythm of the room itself, each guest felt it now. The room's pulse merging with their own, a heartbeat that was not theirs, a force beyond comprehension asserting control, the whispers layering over every thought, dissecting each memory, twisting them into dread. Samuel's body jerked violently, as if reacting to each syllable. The first real touch of death in motion, Jonathan's skin crawled as invisible tendrils grazed him, testing, toying, asserting presence. The table itself seemed aware, surfaces shifting subtly, plates tilting imperceptibly, knives aligning with precision, and the pastries quivered. Sugars twisting into shapes that mimicked tongues, serpents, hands. Every object in the hall had become an instrument of influence, a tool of punishment. Jonathan's pulse quickened as the realization sank in. This was no mere haunting, no chance event. The supper was alive, controlled by intent. The chandelier above swayed violently, crystal prisms scattering fragmented light, shadows leaping from one surface to another, coiling around torsos, fingers, necks, deliberate in precision. Each movement of darkness measured, calculated, designed to induce maximum terror. Each twitch, each shiver, each convulsion catalogued by Esther's calm observation, the room bending around her will, the unseen hands exacting obedience and fear in tandem. Samuel's body twitched violently, convulsions sharp and rhythmic, the shadows constricting, curling, pressing, forcing involuntary movements. The whispers threaded into minds now like threads through fabric, naming sins, weaknesses, fears, revealing secrets no one dared speak aloud. Jonathan struggled against invisible bonds. Legs stiff, chest tight, muscles taut as the shadows tested him. The table, the chandelier, even the air itself a participant. Each element moving in concert, orchestrated by forces unseen beyond human comprehension. The supper now a mechanism of revelation and punishment. Each gasp, each twitch, each tremor amplified by the room's pulse, feeding the pattern, drawing attention. Judgment, punishment, and the first clear deaths were only a prelude. Esther's calm radiated outward, each subtle gesture, each tilt of her head, controlling the shadows, whispers, and air. The guests realized with terror that their fear was not incidental but necessary. A currency the supper consumed with relish, Jonathan's vision blurred as tendrils brushed his neck, crawling upward, teasing skin, testing resolve, his limbs resisting, yet succumbing to invisible restraint. The hall's pulse synchronized with every gasp, every twitch, every fear, each beat drawing the living deeper into the ritual, deeper into the inevitable. The unseen hands guiding, pressing, manipulating, punishing. A faint cracking sound echoed from Samuel's body, subtle but unmistakable, as the shadows applied pressure, testing endurance, forcing reactions. Jonathan's heart raced, mind straining to comprehend the intelligence behind the assault, and every muscle in his body screamed in tension. The whispers now layered over one another, a chorus of accusation and revelation, dissecting minds, twisting memory, exposing vulnerabilities, naming sins. And Jonathan understood with cold certainty that the table, the room, the supper, was itself a conscious predator, each object and shadow a tool wielded with precision. And the unseen hands were everywhere, guiding, pressing, punishing, claiming mortality in deliberate rhythm. The remaining guests trembled, some clutching each other, some frozen, bodies locked in tense compliance, each aware that movement could provoke further pain, further death, each heartbeat a countdown, each breath laborious, metallic tang now an omen. Samuel's convulsions slowing as the shadows tightened, and Jonathan realized with horror that resistance was meaningless. Submission inevitable, Esther's calm and unyielding axis, the unseen hands extending, curling, manipulating, and the supper's work had only begun. Patient, precise, relentless, and far from finished. The room had become a crucible, air thick and almost tangible, pressing down, constricting lungs. Bending spines, Jonathan Cole staggered, feeling invisible fingers clutching at his shoulders, squeezing, testing, every breath labored, metallic tang of sugar and wine now biting, invasive. A reminder that indulgence had become mortal danger. Samuel Duval convulsed again, his body trembling violently as the shadows coiled tighter, curling over limbs, pressing against torsos, pulling taut muscles as if orchestrating a cruel symphony. Esther remained calm at the periphery, hands unmoving, gaze fixed, yet every twitch, every tremor, every gasp of the guests responded to her silent will. She had orchestrated this supper over decades, every detail, every ingredient, every glimmer of candlelight accounted for, shadows and whispers instruments of her meticulous design. The chandelier above groaned, swaying violently, casting fractured light across the walls, elongating shadows that twisted independently, curling, coiling, a living presence that slithered along floors and walls. Brushing against ankles, arms, necks, each tendril tested boundaries, probing for fear, weakness, vulnerability, and the guests could feel it, every nerve ending alive with terror. Jonathan's chest constricted as if gripped by unseen hands, muscles taut, limbs resisting invisible force, yet succumbing slowly, inexorably, each convulsion, each gasp, each falter catalogued by the whispers threading through minds, naming sins, exposing secrets, dissecting memory, an invisible ledger of human failing laid bare before an unfeeling but deliberate intelligence. Samuel's body arched violently, tendrils constricting, fingers clawing at the table, sweat beading across pale skin, eyes wide rolling, every movement dictated by forces unseen yet absolute. Jonathan reached instinctively to help, only to feel invisible resistance. The shadows testing, punishing, asserting dominance. The table itself seemed alive, tilting subtly, edges shifting, knives and plates aligning with terrifying precision, every object in the room an instrument of influence, a tool of torment. The whispers now coherent, threading through every mind, layering accusation upon fear, a constant reminder of helplessness. Jonathan's gaze flicked towards Samuel, dread pooling, understanding that death had now fully claimed its first victim, and the rhythm of the feast demanded more. The walls seemed to pulse subtly, shadows stretching higher, curling around the chandeliers, along floorboards, climbing legs, wrapping torsos, lifting hair, pressing cold, unyielding, deliberate, patient, Jonathan gasped, muscles taut, chest constricting further. Realizing resistance was meaningless, the supper had become a predator, and they were its prey. Each heartbeat now synchronized with the room's pulse. Each breath laborious, heavy, metallic tang sharp and persistent. Samuel's convulsions slowing under the shadow's grip. Jonathan felt the inevitability of submission, the futility of escape, and the whispers layered over his thoughts, naming fear, weakness, guilt, sin, vulnerability, exposing each hidden corner of mind. Esther's calm remained unbroken, her presence the center of chaos. Subtle movements of her hands, a tilt of her head, orchestrating shadows. Whispers, air itself. Jonathan's eyes darted across the room, catching glimpses of tendrils wrapping around the remaining guests, curling, pressing, constricting, testing, punishing, each motion deliberate, precise. And the surviving diners realized with dread that every twitch, every falter, every gasp fed the supper. A mechanism of revelation and mortality, the room alive, aware, patient, and utterly controlled. A faint cracking sound echoed from Samuel's body as the shadows tightened further, testing endurance, forcing convulsions, limbs jerking violently under pressure. Jonathan felt a shock run through his own body, tendrils brushing skin, teasing muscle, each contact an assertion, a demonstration of control. The whispers layered, dissecting thoughts, naming vulnerabilities, cataloging sins, reinforcing terror, every sensory perception amplified by fear, every movement constrained by invisible precision. The table, the chandelier, the walls, the air, instruments in the supper's cruel design. Death no longer threatened, it asserted itself through the supper. Methodical, inevitable. The guests shivered, bodies taut, frozen in terror, each aware that motion, resistance, or misstep would invite punishment. The shadows wrapping higher, pressing tighter, each tendril a measured instrument, every breath, every heartbeat, every twitch of the flesh a part of the pattern. Jonathan realized with icy clarity that the supper, the shadows, the whispers, the very room, were one entity, conscious, deliberate, patient, and the work had only begun. Esther's calm radiating across the room, a silent axis controlling chaos, enforcing mortality, and the grip tightened with absolute inevitability. The air had grown heavier, thickened, almost tactile. Pressing against lungs and ribs, Jonathan Cole staggered. Muscles taut, chest constricted, invisible fingers curling around his shoulders, testing, asserting, each movement resisted, each breath a labor. Samuel Duval's convulsions slowed slightly, the shadows now coiling with deliberate patience, a prelude to something far more permanent. The metallic tang of sugar and wine now sharp, invasive, filling every sense with the reminder that indulgence had become peril. And each tremor, twitch, and falter of the guests fed the rhythm of the supper. Esther standing calm, her presence absolute, orchestrating without motion, every shadow, whisper, and breath of air responding to her will, each element a note in a symphony of terror, the room alive, aware, patient. The chandelier above groaned under invisible pressure, swinging violently, scattering fractured light across the hall, shadows leaping from one surface to another, stretching along walls, climbing floorboards. Curling around limbs and torsos, the first deaths had awakened the room, energized it. Shadows now bolder, moving with intent, deliberate precision. Testing each guest, each muscle, each pulse, Jonathan's heart raced, chest constricted. Realizing that resistance was futile, the supper had become predator, the guests prey. Samuel convulsed violently again, tendrils pressing, wrapping, constricting, forcing movements, and the whispers threaded into minds. Dissecting, naming weaknesses, sins, fears, exposing the hidden, twisting it into terror. The table itself seemed to pulse subtly, shifting, tilting, edges moving, plates and knives aligning with uncanny precision, pastries quivering, sugars twisting into impossible patterns, tongues, serpents, hands, each object an instrument of influence, every surface a tool for the unseen force. Jonathan staggered, muscles locked, chest pressing inward. The whispers now layered in sentences, coherent yet horrifying, threading through minds, naming each flaw, each fear, revealing secrets no one dared speak. Samuel's body reacted violently to each syllable, convulsing under invisible hands, and Jonathan understood with cold clarity that mortality was no longer optional. The supper exacted payment for presence. Esther remained at the periphery, calm, poised, eyes glimmering with subtle triumph, her hands almost inert, yet shadows obeyed her slightest gesture, curling higher, twisting tighter, pressing against the living. Each gasp, twitch, and falter of the remaining guests fed the rhythm of the room. The mechanism of punishment and revelation. Jonathan's limbs strained against invisible tendrils brushing his skin. Teasing, testing, asserting dominance, the whispers now forming layers of accusation and revelation, threading together past sins, exposing vulnerability, twisting thought into dread. The chandelier swayed, crystal prisms scattering spectral eyes across faces, shadows stretching, coiling, merging. A mass alive with intent, hunger, patience. Samuel's body jerked violently, tendrils constricting, curling, pressing, forcing involuntary movements. Jonathan felt invisible pressure tighten across chest, ribs resisting, muscles taut. The whispers now dissected memory with surgical precision, naming hidden failings, cataloging fear, reinforcing helplessness, and the remaining guests realized the supper was a conscious predator. Each object, shadow, whisper, and breath an instrument of control. Esther's calm central to its execution, every action deliberate, patient, inexorable. The room alive, aware, orchestrating mortality. A faint cracking echoed as the shadows tightened further on Samuel, testing endurance, forcing compliance. Jonathan shivered as tendrils brushed, teasing, asserting, a constant pressure threading through body and mind. Metallic tang now bitter and sharp. Each heartbeat a countdown, each breath laborious. The table, chandelier, walls, air. Instruments in the supper's cruel, deliberate design. Death now asserted itself with precision. Methodical, inevitable. The first fatalities a prelude. The rhythm of terror fully established. The remaining guests shivered, muscles taut, frozen, aware that every twitch, every falter, every breath could provoke punishment. Shadows coiled higher, pressing tighter, each movement deliberate, a test, each heartbeat synchronized with the room's pulse, each gasp amplified, fear feeding the mechanism. And Jonathan understood with stark clarity, the supper, the shadows, the whispers, and Esther were one entity, conscious, deliberate, patient, orchestrating revelation, punishment, mortality, and the ritual had only begun. The work far from finished, the table hungering, and the night stretching into a labyrinth of unending terror. The hall had transformed into a chamber of living dread, shadows crawling with purpose, brushing against ankles, arms, torsos, each tendril testing, asserting. Enforcing obedience, Jonathan Cole staggered, chest constricting, muscles taut, the metallic tang of sugar and wine now harsh, bitter, invasive. Each taste a reminder that indulgence carried mortality. Samuel Duval convulsed again, his body reacting to invisible hands, twisting, jerking, the whispers threading through his mind with surgical precision, naming fears, sins, secrets long buried. Twisting thought into panic, Esther observed calmly, her gaze unbroken, hands motionless, yet every twitch, every gasp, every falter responded to her silent orchestration, the room alive, patient, and utterly controlled. The chandelier groaned violently, crystal prisms scattering fractured light across the hall, elongating shadows into serpentine forms that moved independently, curling along walls, wrapping limbs, pressing cold, deliberate. Each guest felt it, the unmistakable intelligence in the darkness, the deliberate manipulation of flesh and fear. Jonathan's muscles strained against invisible restraint, limbs locking, chest pressing inward, resistance futile. The table itself seemed alive, shifting subtly, tilting, edges stretching, knives and plates aligning with a precision that defied reason, pastries quivering, sugars twisting into grotesque shapes, hands, tongues, serpents, instruments of the unseen force, feeding terror into the living. Samuel's convulsions intensified, tendrils coiling tighter, pressing against limbs, torso, twisting, forcing involuntary motions. Jonathan gasped as invisible hands brushed his skin, teasing, asserting control, and he realized with horror that submission was the only option. The whispers threading deeper, dissecting, naming every hidden weakness, amplifying dread. The room's pulse now synchronized with heartbeats. Every breath laborious, every twitch amplified. The chandelier swaying, shadows stretching higher, merging, a mass-aware, deliberate patient, and the remaining guests trembled, frozen in tense compliance, muscles taut, knowing any misstep invited punishment. The whispers now forming layers of accusation, judgment, revelation. Esther's calm radiated outward, subtle movements of her hands orchestrating shadows, whispers, and even the air. Jonathan's eyes darted to Samuel, body jerking violently under invisible constraints, tendrils pressing, coiling, lifting hair, testing endurance, the room alive with predation, each gasp, each shiver, each falter feeding the rhythm, the supper's mechanism of revelation and punishment. Jonathan's limbs resisting, chest constricted, yet succumbing slowly, inexorably, realizing with icy clarity that the supper was conscious, deliberate, a predator, the shadows instruments of control, every object in the hall complicit, every detail orchestrated by Esther's calm mastery. A faint cracking sound echoed subtly from Samuel's body as tendrils tightened. Muscles straining, forcing compliance, Jonathan felt invisible pressure brush skin, teasing, asserting, whispers dissecting memory, naming sins, cataloging fear, exposing vulnerability, amplifying helplessness. Each heartbeat became a countdown, each breath laborious, metallic tang biting the table, chandelier, walls, and air instruments in a deliberate design. Mortality asserted with precision, methodical, inevitable, the first fatalities a prelude, terror fully established, the supper alive, patient, omniscient. The remaining guests shivered, muscles locked, frozen, aware that each twitch, falter, or breath could provoke punishment, shadows curling higher, pressing tighter, each motion deliberate, calculated, a test, the rhythm of the room merging with their pulse, each gasp amplified, fear consumed and redirected. Jonathan understood. The supper, the shadows, the whispers, and Esther were a single conscious entity, orchestrating revelation, punishment, mortality, and madness. The mechanism unstoppable, the night stretching endlessly into dread. Jonathan's mind began to falter, thoughts splintering, perception warping. Samuel's convulsions slowing only briefly as shadows shifted, coiling toward the next target. Esther's calm unyielding, her eyes glimmering with triumph and calculation, every twitch, every gasp, every heartbeat feeding the ritual, orchestrating revelation and judgment. And the guests realized with crushing clarity that sanity itself was a casualty, the veil of madness descending, enveloping the remaining survivors. The table, the shadows, the whispers, and Esther exacting obedience, feeding mortality. And the night had only begun, patient, precise, relentless, and ending. The shadows had grown bold beyond previous measures, coiling with intent, brushing, pressing, constricting. Jonathan Cole staggered, chest tight, muscles taut, invisible fingers testing limits. Each breath was laborious, metallic tang of sugar and wine sharp, invasive, a constant reminder that indulgence had become lethal. Samuel Duval's convulsions intensified, tendrils wrapping, twisting, forcing motion. The whispers threading through minds, dissecting, naming sins, weaknesses, fears, long-buried secrets twisted into terror. Esther's calm at the edge of the hall absolute, her gaze unbroken, hands unmoving, yet the shadows, whispers, even the very air obeyed her silent orchestration. The room alive, patient, and fully under her dominion. The chandelier groaned violently, swinging as fractured light scattered across walls, shadows elongating, twisting into serpentine forms, moving independently, curling around torsos, limbs, chairs, floors, deliberate. Deliberate in every motion, Jonathan's heart raced, chest constricting further, realizing that resistance was futile. The supper a predator, guests prey. Samuel's body jerked violently, tendrils pressing, coiling tighter, forcing convulsions, and the whispers dissected thought, naming flaws, weaknesses, sins, exposing hidden corners of memory, twisting understanding into dread, every nerve taut, every pulse a countdown. The table itself seemed alive, edges shifting, tilting subtly, knives and plates aligning with uncanny precision, pastries quivering, sugars twisting into grotesque forms, hands, serpents, tongues, instruments in the hands of an unseen force. Jonathan staggered, muscles locked, chest pressing inward, whispers now coherent, threading through minds, laying bare fears, past sins, secrets unspoken. Samuel's body responding violently, jerking under invisible constraints. Jonathan realized mortality was now inevitable, and the first irreversible death would mark the true power of the supper, a prelude to carnage. Esther's calm radiated, subtle gestures orchestrating shadows, whispers air itself. Jonathan's eyes darted to Samuel, body convulsing violently under unseen hands, tendrils coiling, curling, pressing, testing endurance, the room alive with predation, deliberate, conscious, patient. Each twitch, each gasp, each falter feeding the rhythm. The mechanism of punishment and revelation, Jonathan's limbs resisting, chest constricted yet slowly succumbing, understanding that the supper was conscious. A predator, shadows, instruments of execution, objects in the room complicit, every detail executed with cold precision. A faint cracking sound echoed subtly as the shadows tightened further around Samuel. Forcing compliance, movement involuntary, Jonathan felt invisible pressure brush his skin, teasing, asserting dominance. Metallic tang sharp and biting, whispers dissecting memory, naming sins, cataloging fear, amplifying helplessness. Each heartbeat now a countdown. Each breath laborious, table, chandelier, walls, air instruments in the deliberate design. Death asserting itself with precision, methodical, inevitable, and the first irreversible life had been marked. Samuel's convulsions slowing, body stiffening, shadows maintaining constriction. The first permanent loss now absolute. The remaining guests shivered, muscles taut, frozen, aware that each twitch, falter, or breath could provoke punishment. Shadows curling higher, pressing tighter. Each motion deliberate, each heartbeat synchronized with the room's pulse. Each gasp amplified, fear consumed, redirected. Jonathan realized the supper. Shadows, whispers, and Esther were one entity, orchestrating revelation, judgment, mortality, and madness, mechanism unstoppable, night stretching endlessly into dread, patience absolute. Jonathan's mind faltered, perception warping, Samuel's death marking the line between temporary torment and irreversible consequence. Esther's calm unyielding, eyes glimmering with triumph, each twitch, gasp, heartbeat feeding ritual, orchestrating revelation, judgment, mortality, the veil of madness descending fully upon remaining survivors. Shadows dominating the table, whispers, air, walls, all instruments of absolute control. And the night had only begun, precise, relentless, unending. The hall had become a living predator, walls breathing, shadows writhing, curling, pressing against torso's limbs. Jonathan Cole staggered, muscles taut, chest constricting, invisible fingers brushing, testing, asserting control. Each breath a labor, metallic tang of sugar and wine sharp, invasive, a bitter reminder that indulgence had become lethal. Samuel Duval now still, his body claimed by shadows, the first irreversible loss, and the room seemed to pulse with newfound hunger. Testing remaining guests with deliberate, calculated precision, Esther's calm unwavering, hands unmoving. Yet every convulsion, twitch, gasp of the remaining diners orchestrated by her silent mastery. Shadows alive, whispers intelligent. The supper a machine of death and revelation. The chandelier above groaned, swinging violently, scattering fractured light that elongated shadows into serpentine shapes, curling along walls, creeping over floors, wrapping limbs and torsos, deliberate in each motion. Jonathan's chest tightened, muscles straining. Understanding resistance was futile. The supper alive, guests pray. Samuel's death a signal. The shadows now bolder, asserting dominance, coiling higher, pressing tighter, forcing convulsions. The whispers threading through minds, dissecting fears, sins, secrets, twisting understanding into dread, every nerve taut. Pulse a countdown toward inevitable collapse. The table itself shifted subtly, tilting, edges moving, knives and plates aligning with uncanny precision, pastries quivering, sugars twisting into grotesque forms, hands, serpents, tongues, instruments in the hands of unseen forces. Jonathan staggered, limbs locked, chest pressing inward, whispers coherent, threading through minds, exposing every weakness, past sin, hidden guilt. Samuel's death a warning and prelude. Jonathan's own body reacting violently to invisible constraints. The first irreversible loss amplifying terror. Mortality inevitable. The room asserting control over living flesh with absolute precision. Esther's calm radiated subtle movements, orchestrating shadows. Whispers, even the air itself, Jonathan's eyes darting. Witnessing tendrils wrap tighter around guests. Coiling, curling, pressing, testing endurance. The room alive with predation. Deliberate, conscious, patient. Each twitch, each gasp, each falter feeding the rhythm. The mechanism of punishment and revelation. Jonathan resisting, chest constricted, realizing the supper was conscious. A predator, Shadows' instruments of execution, every object complicit, every detail executed with perfect calculation. Samuel's death an overture to the cascade now accelerating. A faint cracking echoed as tendrils tightened further. Guests convulsing violently. Forced movements involuntary. Jonathan's body tense under invisible pressure. Teasing, asserting dominance. Metallic tang sharp and biting. Whispers dissecting memory. Exposing sin, amplifying helplessness. Each heartbeat now a countdown. Each breath laborious. The table, chandelier walls. Air instruments in deliberate design. Death now asserting itself with methodical precision. The cascade unstoppable. First irreversible life feeding the rhythm of carnage. The room alive, aware, patient, hungry. The remaining diners shivered. Muscles locked, frozen, aware any twitch, falter. Breath could provoke punishment. Shadows curling higher. Pressing tighter. Motions deliberate, each heartbeat synchronized with the room's pulse. Each gasp amplified. Fear consumed and redirected. Jonathan realizing the supper. Shadows, whispers, and Esther were one entity. Orchestrating revelation, judgment, mortality, and madness unstoppable. Night stretching endlessly into dread, patience absolute. Each moment drawing them closer to oblivion. Jonathan's mind began to fracture, perception warping. Samuel's death a clear demarcation between temporary torment and irreversible consequence. Esther's calm unyielding, eyes glimmering with triumph, every twitch, gasp, heartbeat feeding ritual, orchestrating revelation, judgment, mortality, the veil of madness descending fully upon the remaining guests. Shadows dominant the table, whispers, air walls, all instruments of absolute control. And the night had only begun, precise, relentless, unending, the cascade accelerating with deliberate, patient hunger. The hall had descended into omnipotent silence, each gasp, each twitch, magnified by shadows coiling, pressing, curling around limbs, torsos. Jonathan Cole staggered, muscles taut, chest constricting. Invisible hands brushing, testing, asserting dominance. Metallic tang of sugar and wine biting sharper, invasive. A grim reminder that indulgence now equaled mortality. Samuel Duval's body still claimed by shadows, the first irreversible victim. The room alive with intent. The remaining guests prey. Esther's calm unwavering, hands motionless, gaze fixed, orchestrating every twitch, convulsion, gasp through unseen instruments. The whispers threading through minds, dissecting, revealing, amplifying dread with surgical precision. The chandelier groaned violently, scattering fractured light, shadows stretching into serpentine forms, climbing walls, wrapping around limbs, pressing cold. Deliberate, patient, every movement a test, every pulse a countdown. Jonathan's muscles locked, chest pressing inward. Understanding resistance was futile. The supper alive, conscious, predators stalking the living, whispers threading through minds. Dissecting sins, naming weaknesses, secrets exposed, understanding twisted into terror. Samuel's death a signal, an overture, the shadows now bolder, asserting dominance, their intelligence undeniable, relentless. The table itself shifted subtly, tilting, edges moving, knives and plates aligning with precise, almost sentient intent, pastries quivering, sugars twisting into grotesque forms, hands, serpents' tongues, instruments of control. Jonathan staggered, limbs taut, chest pressing inward, whispers now coherent, threading through minds, exposing every weakness, past sin, hidden guilt. Samuel's death, the prelude to the cascade now fully realized. The first irreversible life-amplifying terror, mortality inevitable. The room asserting control over living flesh, objects complicit, details executed with calculated perfection. Esther's calm radiated outward, subtle gestures orchestrating shadows, whispers, even air itself. Jonathan's eyes darting across the hall, witnessing tendrils coil tighter around guests, curling, pressing, testing endurance, the room alive, conscious, deliberate, patient, each twitch, gasp, falter feeding rhythm, the mechanism of punishment and revelation. Jonathan resisting, chest constricted, realizing the supper itself was conscious. A predator, shadows instruments of execution, objects in the hall complicit, details executed with terrifying precision. Samuel's death an overture, the cascade accelerating toward inevitable dominance. A faint cracking echoed as shadows tightened further, guests convulsing violently, forced movements involuntary. Jonathan's body tense under invisible pressure, teasing, asserting dominance, metallic tang sharp, whispers dissecting memory, exposing sin, amplifying helplessness, every heartbeat a countdown, each breath laborious. The table, chandelier, walls, air instruments in deliberate, precise design, death asserting itself methodically, the cascade unstoppable, first irreversible life-feeding rhythm of carnage, the room alive, aware, patient, insatiable, the remaining diners shivered, muscles taut, frozen, aware each twitch, falter. Breath could provoke punishment, shadows curling higher, pressing tighter, each motion deliberate, heartbeat synchronized with room's pulse, each gasp amplified, fear consumed, redirected. Jonathan realizing the supper, shadows, whispers, and Esther were one entity, orchestrating revelation, judgment, mortality, and madness unstoppable, night stretching endlessly into dread, patience absolute, moments drawing closer to oblivion, the omnipotent silence reigning. Jonathan's mind fractured further, perception warping. Samuel's death marking the line between temporary torment and irreversible consequence. Esther's calm unyielding, eyes glimmering with triumph, every twitch, gasp, heartbeat feeding ritual, orchestrating revelation, judgment, mortality, veil of madness descending fully upon remaining guests, shadows dominant table, whispers, air walls, instruments of absolute control, the night only beginning, precise, relentless, unending, the omnipotent silence now complete, the feast alive, patient, omniscient, terrifyingly absolute. The hall had become a labyrinth of terror, shadows twisting, coiling, pressing against torsos, limbs. Jonathan Cole staggered, muscles taut, chest constricting, invisible fingers brushing, testing, asserting dominance, every breath laborious, metallic tang of sugar and wine sharp, invasive, a bitter reminder that indulgence now equaled death. Samuel Duval's body motionless, the first irreversible victim. The room alive, intelligent, predatory. The remaining guests prey, Esther calm at the edge, eyes fixed, hands still, orchestrating every twitch, convulsion, gasp through unseen instruments, whispers threading through minds, dissecting, exposing, amplifying dread with surgical precision, every thought no longer private, every memory violated. The chandelier groaned violently, light scattering fractured, shadows stretching into serpentine forms, climbing walls, wrapping around limbs, pressing cold, deliberate, patient, each motion a test, every pulse a countdown. Jonathan's chest tightened further, muscles straining. Understanding resistance was meaningless. The supper alive, conscious. Predators stalking, whispers dissecting sins, naming weaknesses, secrets laid bare, perception twisting, understanding corrupted. Samuel's death the overture, the shadows bolder, intelligence undeniable. Relentless, calculated, feeding on panic. The table seemed to breathe subtly, tilting, edges moving, knives and plates aligning with uncanny, sentient precision, pastries quivering, sugars twisting grotesquely. Hands, serpents' tongues, instruments of control. Jonathan staggered, limbs locked, chest pressing inward, whispers coherent, threading through minds, exposing every weakness, hidden guilt, past sins. Samuel's death a prelude, amplifying terror, mortality inevitable, room asserting control over living flesh, objects complicit, details executed with calculated perfection, the feast now fully realized as predator, instrument of revelation and punishment. Esther's calm radiated outward, gestures subtle, orchestrating shadows, whispers, air itself. Jonathan witnessing tendrils coil tighter around guests, curling, pressing, testing endurance, room alive, conscious, deliberate, patient, each twitch, gasp, falter feeding rhythm, mechanism of punishment and revelation. Jonathan resisting, chest constricted, realizing the supper itself conscious, predator, shadows instruments of execution, objects complicit, Samuel's death overture, cascade accelerating, inevitability absolute, minds beginning to fray, perception bending, reality dissolving. A faint cracking echoed as shadows tightened, guests convulsing violently, movements involuntary, Jonathan's body tense under invisible pressure, teasing, asserting, metallic tang sharp, whispers dissecting memory, exposing sin, amplifying helplessness, every heartbeat countdown, each breath laborious, table, chandelier, walls, air instruments in deliberate design, death asserting methodically, cascade unstoppable. First irreversible life-feeding rhythm. Room alive, aware, patient, insatiable. The breaking of minds now imminent. Sanity teetering on the edge. Remaining diners shivered. Muscles taut, frozen, aware each twitch. Falter. Breath could provoke punishment. Shadows curling higher. Pressing tighter. Motion deliberate, heartbeat synchronized with room's pulse. Each gasp amplified, fear consumed, redirected. Jonathan realized the supper. Shadows, whispers. Esther, one entity, orchestrating revelation. Judgment, mortality, madness, unstoppable. Night stretching endlessly into dread. Moments drawing closer to oblivion. Perception splintering. Sanity slipping. The breaking of minds underway. The feast omniscient. Jonathan's mind fractured fully. Perception warping. Samuel's death demarcating temporary torment from irreversible consequence. Esther calm, eyes glimmering triumph. Every twitch, gasp, heartbeat feeding ritual. Orchestrating revelation, judgment, mortality. Veil of madness descending fully upon remaining guests. Shadows dominant, table whispers air. Walls instruments of absolute control. Night only beginning. Precise, relentless, unending. Surviving mind splintering, reality undone. The breaking of minds complete. The supper alive, patient, omniscient. Terrifyingly absolute. The hall had become unrecognizable. Walls pulsating. Shadows twisting with intent. Curling around torsos, limbs. Jonathan Cole staggered. Chest tight, muscles taut. Invisible fingers brushing. Testing, asserting control, every breath a labor. Metallic tang of sugar and wine sharp, invasive. A reminder indulgence had become mortal peril. Samuel Duval's body still. Claimed irreversibly. The first warning completed. The remaining guests pray. Esther calm, hands still, gaze fixed. Orchestrating every twitch, convulsion, gasp through unseen instruments. Whispers threading minds, dissecting, exposing. Amplifying dread with precision. The feast now a living predator. Insatiable, omniscient, absolute. The chandelier groaned violently, scattering fractured light. Shadows stretching into serpentine forms, climbing walls, wrapping limbs, pressing cold. Deliberate, patient, every movement a test. Each heartbeat a countdown. Jonathan's chest tightening, muscles straining. Understanding resistance was meaningless. The supper-conscious predators stalking living flesh. Whispers dissecting sins, naming weaknesses, secrets exposed. Perception twisting, understanding corrupted. Samuel's death overture, shadows bolder. Intelligence undeniable. Relentless feeding panic. The final hunger awakened, insatiable, patient, deliberate. The table shifted subtly, tilting, edges moving. Knives and plates aligning with uncanny precision. Pastries quivering, sugars twisting grotesquely. Hands, serpents, tongues, instruments of control. Jonathan staggered, limbs locked. Chest pressing inward. Whispers coherent, threading through minds. Exposing every weakness, hidden guilt, past sins. Samuel's death a prelude. Amplifying terror, mortality inevitable. The room asserting control over flesh. Objects complicit. Details executed with perfection. The final hunger now claiming every sense. Every nerve, every pulse. Esther's calm radiated. Gestures subtle, orchestrating shadows. Whispers air itself. Jonathan's eyes darted to guests. Tendrils coiling tighter. Curling, pressing, testing endurance. Room alive, conscious. Deliberate, patient, each twitch, gasp. Falter feeding rhythm. Mechanism of punishment and revelation. Jonathan resisting. Chest constricted. Realizing the supper itself conscious. Predator. Shadows instruments of execution. Objects complicit. Cascade accelerating. Inevitability absolute. The final hunger descending. Consuming mind, will, body and soul. A faint cracking echoed as shadows tightened further. Guests convulsing violently. Movements involuntary. Jonathan tense under invisible pressure. Teasing, asserting dominance. Metallic tang sharp. Whispers dissecting memory. Exposing sin, amplifying helplessness. Every heartbeat countdown, each breath laborious. Table, chandelier, walls. Air instruments in deliberate design. Death asserting methodically. Cascade unstoppable, irreversible. Feeding rhythm, room alive, aware, patient. The final hunger now absolute. Each surviving nerve and sinew prey to deliberate cruelty. The remaining diners shivered. Muscles taut, frozen, aware each twitch. Falter. Breath could provoke punishment. Shadows curling higher. Pressing tighter. motion deliberate, heartbeat synchronized with room's pulse. Each gasp amplified, fear consumed, redirected. Jonathan realizing the supper. Shadows, whispers. Esther, one entity, orchestrating revelation. Judgment, mortality, madness, unstoppable. Night stretching endlessly into dread. Moments drawing closer to ultimate oblivion. Perception splintering, reality bending. The final hunger consuming all. Jonathan's mind shattered, perception warping. Samuel's death demarcating temporary torment from irreversible consequence. Esther calm, eyes glimmering triumph. Every twitch, gasp, heartbeat feeding ritual. Orchestrating revelation, judgment, mortality. Veil of madness descending fully upon remaining guests. Shadows dominant, table, whispers, air. Walls instruments of absolute control. Night only beginning. Precise, relentless, unending. Surviving minds broken, reality undone. The final hunger complete. The supper alive, omniscient. Terrifyingly absolute, patient and eternal. The hall had become unrecognizable. Shadows thrumming with purpose. Curling around torsos, limbs, Jonathan Cole staggering. Muscles taut, chest constricting. Invisible hands testing. Asserting control. Every breath laborious. Metallic tang of sugar and wine biting. Invasive. A grim reminder that indulgence equaled annihilation. Samuel Duval claimed irreversibly. First irreversible warning completed. Remaining guests pray. Esther calm at the edge. Hands unmoving. Gaze fixed. Orchestrating every twitch, convulsion. Gasp through unseen instruments. Whispers threading minds, dissecting, exposing. Amplifying dread. The supper alive, predator omniscient. Absolute. The chandelier groaned violently, scattering fractured light. Shadows stretching into serpentine forms, climbing walls. Wrapping limbs, pressing cold. Deliberate, patient, every movement a test. Each heartbeat a countdown. Jonathan's chest tightened further. Muscles straining, resistance meaningless. The supper conscious. Predators stalking flesh. Whispers dissecting sins, naming weaknesses. Exposing secrets. Perception twisting. Understanding corrupted. Samuel's death overture, shadows bolder. Intelligence undeniable. Relentless feeding panic. The penultimate devouring imminent, insatiable, patient, deliberate. The table shifted subtly, tilting, edges moving. Knives and plates aligning with uncanny precision. Pastries quivering, sugars twisting grotesquely. Hands, serpents, tongues, instruments of control. Jonathan staggered, limbs locked. Chest pressing inward. Whispers coherent, threading through minds. Exposing every weakness, hidden guilt, past sins. Samuel's death prelude. Amplifying terror, mortality inevitable. The room asserting control over flesh. Objects complicit. Details executed with perfection. The penultimate devouring, consuming every nerve, every pulse, every heartbeat of the remaining guests. Esther's calm radiated. Gestures subtle, orchestrating shadows. Whispers air itself, Jonathan's eyes darting. Tendrils coiling tighter around guests. Curling, pressing, testing endurance. Room alive, conscious. Deliberate, patient, each twitch, gasp. Falter feeding rhythm. Mechanism of punishment and revelation. Jonathan resisting. Chest constricted. Realizing the supper itself, conscious. Predator. Shadows, instruments of execution. Objects complicit. Cascade accelerating. Inevitability absolute. The penultimate devouring, consuming will mind and flesh. A faint cracking echoed as shadows tightened further. Guests convulsing violently. Movements involuntary. Jonathan tense under invisible pressure. Teasing, asserting dominance. Metallic tang sharp. Whispers dissecting memory. Exposing sin. Amplifying helplessness. Every heartbeat a countdown. Each breath laborious. Table, chandelier, walls. Hair instruments in deliberate design. Death asserting methodically. Cascade unstoppable, irreversible. Feeding rhythm, room alive, aware, patient. The penultimate devouring now absolute. Each remaining sense prey to deliberate cruelty. Sanity unraveling. Remaining diners shivered, muscles taut, frozen. Aware each twitch, falter. Breath could provoke punishment. Shadows curling higher. Pressing tighter. Motion deliberate, heartbeat synchronized with room's pulse. Each gasp amplified. Fear consumed, redirected. Jonathan realizing the supper. Shadows, whispers. Esther, one entity. Orchestrating revelation. Judgment, mortality, madness unstoppable. Night stretching endlessly into dread. Moments drawing closer to ultimate obliteration. perception splintering, reality bending. The penultimate devouring near completion. Jonathan's mind fractured fully, perception warping. Samuel's death marking the line between torment and irreversible annihilation. Esther calm, eyes glimmering triumph. Every twitch, gasp, heartbeat feeding ritual, orchestrating revelation, judgment, mortality. Veil of madness descending fully upon remaining guests. Shadows dominant, table, whispers, air. Walls instruments of absolute control. Night only beginning, precise, relentless, unending. Surviving minds broken, reality undone. The penultimate devouring complete. The supper alive, omniscient. Terrifyingly absolute, patient, eternal, and merciless. The hall had become a chamber beyond reality. Shadows writhing like living things. Coiling around torsos, limbs. Jonathan Cole staggering, muscles taut, chest constricting, invisible hands brushing. Testing, asserting control, every breath laborious. Metallic tang of sugar and wine sharp, invasive. A grim reminder that indulgence had become annihilation. Samuel Duval claimed irreversibly. First irreversible loss complete. Remaining guests pray, Esther calm at the edge. Hands unmoving, gaze fixed, orchestrating every twitch, convulsion. Gasp through unseen instruments. Whispers threading minds. Dissecting, exposing, amplifying dread. The supper now a predator of flesh, mind, and soul. The chandelier groaned violently, scattering fractured light. Shadows stretching into serpentine forms, climbing walls. Wrapping limbs pressing cold. Deliberate, patient, every movement a test. Each heartbeat a countdown. Jonathan's chest tightened. Muscles straining, resistance meaningless. The supper alive, conscious. Predators stalking living flesh. Whispers dissecting sins. Naming weaknesses, exposing secrets. Perception twisting. Understanding corrupted. Samuel's death an overture. Shadows bolder. Intelligence undeniable, relentless, feeding panic. The last eclipse approaching. Insatiable, patient, deliberate. The table shifted subtly, tilting, edges moving. Knives and plates aligning with uncanny. Sentient precision. Pastries quivering, sugars twisting grotesquely. Hands. Serpents, tongues, instruments of control. Jonathan staggered, limbs locked, chest pressing inward, whispers threading minds, exposing every weakness, hidden guilt, past sins. Samuel's death prelude, amplifying terror, mortality inevitable. The room asserting control over flesh, objects complicit, details executed with perfection. The last eclipse consuming every nerve, heartbeat, the will of the remaining guests. Esther's calm radiated outward, gestures subtle, orchestrating shadows, whispers, air itself. Jonathan's eyes darting to tendrils coiling tighter. Curling, pressing, testing endurance, room alive, conscious. Deliberate, patient, each twitch, gasp, falter, feeding rhythm. Mechanism of punishment and revelation. Jonathan resisting, chest constricted, realizing the supper itself, conscious. Predator, shadows, instruments of execution, objects complicit, cascade accelerating. Inevitability absolute. The last eclipse descending, consuming mind, will, and flesh entirely. A faint cracking echoed as shadows tightened. Guests convulsing violently. Movements involuntary. Jonathan tense under invisible pressure. Teasing, asserting dominance. Metallic tang sharp. Whispers dissecting memory. Exposing sin. Amplifying helplessness, every heartbeat a countdown. Each breath laborious, table, chandelier, walls, air instruments in deliberate design. Death asserting methodically, cascade unstoppable, irreversible. Feeding rhythm, room alive, aware, patient. The last eclipse now absolute. Every remaining sense prey to deliberate cruelty. Sanity annihilated. Remaining diners shivered. Muscles taut, frozen. Aware each twitch, falter. Breath could provoke punishment. Shadows curling higher. Pressing tighter. Motion deliberate, heartbeat synchronized with room's pulse. Each gasp amplified. Fear consumed, redirected. Jonathan realizing the supper. Shadows, whispers, Esther were one entity. Orchestrating revelation. Judgment, mortality, madness unstoppable. Night stretching endlessly into dread. Perception splintering, reality bending. The last eclipse completing. Darkness claiming all, omniscient. Merciless. Jonathan's mind fractured fully, perception undone. Samuel's death marking the line between torment and irreversible annihilation. Esther calm, eyes glimmering triumph. Every twitch, gasp, heartbeat feeding ritual. Orchestrating revelation, judgment, mortality. veil of madness descending fully upon the remaining guests, shadows dominant, table whispers air, walls instruments of absolute control, night only beginning, precise, relentless, unending, surviving minds shattered, reality devoured, the last eclipse complete, the supper alive, omniscient, terrifyingly absolute, patient, eternal, merciless and final. The hall was empty now, yet alive with echoes, shadows lingering like smoke, tendrils of dark memory brushing against walls and floor. Jonathan Cole slumped, chest constricted, muscles trembling, the metallic tang of sugar and wine lingering, a bitter reminder of what had passed, Samuel Duval's absence absolute, the first irreversible death only the beginning. The supper complete, Esther calm, eyes glimmering with quiet triumph, hands still, gaze fixed on the void, orchestrating absence as much as presence, the whispers fading into silence, leaving a hall heavy with consequence, a room haunted by the memory of the living consumed, the chandelier hung crookedly, fractured light scattering spectral prisms across walls, ceiling, floor, shadows twisting faintly, subtle, patient as if aware, alive, waiting. Jonathan felt the weight of every moment pressed into his mind, each heartbeat a reminder of what had survived and what had been devoured. The table, knives, plates, pastries, inert yet charged with the memory of violence, instruments of a deliberate orchestration. The supper complete, omniscient, Esther's mastery absolute. The room breathing with secrets no one else could ever perceive. Every surface holding the resonance of the forbidden. The air smelled faintly of burnt sugar and iron. Metallic tang hanging in every corner. Jonathan's muscles still taut, limbs trembling under residual pressure. Whispers now threads in memory, dissecting, exposing, leaving imprints that would haunt for lifetimes. Shadows curled in corners, patient, deliberate. Every object in the hall a record of what had been, what had died, what had survived. And Jonathan understood with chilling clarity, the supper was not simply an event. It was a force, a consciousness, a predator that had walked invisibly through history, leaving only silence and consequence in its wake. Esther's calm radiated outward still, subtle, unbroken, her gaze absorbing the emptiness, orchestrating not the living but the aftermath. Each twitch of shadow, each whisper of air, each reflection of fractured light, a testament to the completion of the ritual. Jonathan's mind struggled to reconcile survival with comprehension, the first irreversible death, the cascade of terror, the final eclipse, and now the silence. All threads in a tapestry he could barely perceive. Every detail deliberate, patient, eternal. Jonathan moved, muscles stiff, chest constricted, the hall empty yet alive with memory, shadows reacting subtly to his presence, aware of the remaining consciousness. Every heartbeat amplified by the room, whispers faint, disembodied, cataloguing his survival, measuring every tremor of thought, every shiver of skin, the table inert yet resonating with the memory of the feast, the chandelier cracked, light fractured, every surface an echo of what had been, Esther's mastery now fully revealed, absolute, omniscient, terrifying, and perfectly patient. Outside, the world continued, ignorant, oblivious, while within the hall the memory of horror lingered. Jonathan's mind fractured under the weight. Understanding the forbidden history, the truth no books would contain, every element of the room alive with consequence, shadows coiled patiently, whispers threads in memory, the supper complete, omniscient, eternal, Esther's presence unbroken, a predator now resting yet always aware, the silence after a deliberate instrument of terror, as if the world itself had been paused to witness the conclusion of what should never have been known. Jonathan finally moved toward the door, each step heavy, chest tight, muscles trembling, the metallic tang fading slowly, but leaving permanent resonance in nerves and memory. Shadows lingering, patient, deliberate, every object in the hall holding the record of the feast, the first irreversible death, the cascade, the eclipse, the final devouring, whispers now threads in memory. Esther's calm, eternal, omniscient, the forbidden history complete, the silence after settling like a shroud over a world unknowing, the hall waiting, patient, for the next moment, for the next feast, for the next unholy supper. And Jonathan understood that some truths were never meant to be found, yet once seen, never forgotten.